The other day, one of my followers asked me on my BookTube channel to share my favorite books. And I immediately love the idea because that's the kind of videos that I love to watch myself. I'm always on the lookout for ideas of what to read, and especially if someone is sharing her or his favorite books, you always see that enthusiasm, and that gets me all excited about the books. And I Google them or I'll read some reviews on Goodreads, and oftentimes those books will end up on my to do and to read list as well. So I figured, you know what? I'm just going to share my favorite books. Now, this is a bit of an eclectic list because I started reading in primary school and I never stopped. I grew up basically more in the library than at home. The library was my safe space. We lived in a small house. I've got a brother and a sister, and my brother and my dad were always playing music. My brother loved to play the piano. My dad played like the bagpipes, and he had a church organ in the attic, but it was a house built in the 70s, so it was like there was no sound insulation at all. So oftentimes I would just get overwhelmed and I would just flee to the library. And I remember how much I loved the silence in the library, and I would just crawl into a corner, get a few books, and I would read until they would kick me out. And so some of my favorite books that are on my list today are from those days. And they are favorite because they're excellent books, but also because they remind me of one of the most wonderful times of my childhood, which were the reading times at the library. And I kind of miss having a cozy libraries. Of course, there's a library in my town, but it's a lot more modern now. And I've been to a lot of libraries, and I don't know, they don't do atmosphere really well. But my library when I grew up was really cozy. It was in the 70s, so they liked all the kind of brown and orange colors, and so even the colors felt cozy. I don't know. It's just reading is for me is pure coziness. And so I've kind of recreated that atmosphere here in my own house. So I've got a little Hobbit corner in my living room, and it's got a nice chair, like a leather chair that is super comfortable. I'm close to the radiator, so it's nice and warm. I've got a fake what is it, chimney? No, not a chimney, like a hearth. So I put on the little fake flames, and then a cup of tea, and I'm no longer in this world. I am in my happy place. And so a lot of the books that I'm going to share with you are books that have made me very happy, and a lot of them I've actually read more than once because books have this magical quality of bringing me back to that state of mind. And so there are books that I reread just to feel the way I felt when I first read the book. So without further ado, let me share the first on this list. And it's actually a series of books that I discovered when I was studying in Rome. And I was very late to the game because the entire world was already reading this book or these books, but I just discovered them thanks to a movie in the center of Rome. And a good friend of mine took me there, and he said, "This is a movie, you have to see this." And I was protesting, and it's a kids' movie. He said, "No, don't worry about it. It's fun." And it was dubbed in Italian, but it was an English movie. And of course, I'm talking about Harry Potter. And so that is how I got into Harry Potter. I watched that movie, and Harry Potter was speaking Italian, and I didn't like that so much, but I loved the movie, and so I rewatched it in English, and then I started reading the books, and I couldn't stop anymore. It was so incredible. And even though, especially the first books were written for kids, they had that same quality that the books that I read in my childhood. It was this sense of wonder, this what I loved about the Harry Potter, especially the first few books, was that it took place in our own world, in the regular world, but there is this magical layer that is hidden underneath it. And those were books that I personally loved the most when I was a kid, because those books made me believe that the world wasn't as boring as I thought. And there was always magic somewhere in the air, and those books make me dream about, you know, all these hidden layers of reality. I don't know. It just gave depth to my life. So, and I remember continuing to read, even though I had already finished my studies in Rome, and I came back, and then every time a new book came out, over time, gradually, the books, of course, started to mature, and there were some books in there that I did not enjoy very much. I specifically remember The Order of Phoenix, which I felt was so long and pondering, and it just it felt to me like that book needed much more editing, and maybe could have been like 2/3 of the size. But all in all, an incredible saga, so much fun to read. Number two on my list is from an author whose books I devoured as a child, and in many ways, the Harry Potter books reminded me of those stories. And I'm talking about Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl was a very popular writer when I was young. He was read both by children and by adults. But he was most known in my country for his children's books, specifically Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I remember discovering that book in the library, and I loved the cover because it was this young boy and he was opening this bar of chocolate, and there was this golden wrapper, and I was like, oh, I want to read this book. And I think together with Star Wars, not Harry Potter and the Chocolate Factory, but Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, was the story that I've read the most. Like the original Star Wars: A New Hope, I must have watched it more than 100 times, and I think with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I must have read that book at least 30-40 times. So, and I still sometimes occasionally will reread it or listen to an audiobook. It is just a timeless story. When I saw the movie, I was disappointed, even though everybody loved the movie, but for me the movie was like, it can't hold a candle to the book. The book was so much better, and it's probably also because in my imagination, like the song sings, in my imagination, the Chocolate Factory was so much cooler than what we saw in the theatrical movie. Anyway, I did like the Wonka movie, however. That movie for me had much more of the kind of the flavor, no pun intended, of the original book, much more than the two movies. Another book, I'm just gonna tie it to Roald Dahl's Charlie and Chocolate Factory. Another book that I read a little bit later in life, but I loved it, was I think it's called The Wonderful Life of Henry Sugar. It's actually not really a book, it's more of a novella. It's a short story about this guy who is just very materialistic and superficial, and he always is looking for ways to make money. And then, because his life is so empty, he decides to look for something else or something more, and he gets into contact with this guy who is able to see through things. So he teaches them. I think it's kind of like a guru from India or something like that, and he teaches Henry Sugar that if he concentrates on a flame over time, he will be able to see with his third eye what's on the other side of whatever is hidden, and so he uses that to see the other side of cards, and he goes and gambles in all the casinos, and because he is able to see the back of the card, he wins millions and millions. But of course, money doesn't make him happy at all. And so it's a morality tale, but it also has that strange, fascinating aspect of, there's this magical veneer over a pretty mundane story. Last year, I think was on Netflix, there was a movie adaptation of The Wonderful Life of Henry Sugar. It was good. It was really good. Very different from the story. I like the story more, but still, I was very happy to see that it still works as a story. So I would absolutely recommend that. So it's called I think the Wonderful Life of Henry Sugar. Of course, also a book that has marked my childhood more than most other books, and that was my discovery of The Lord of the Rings. And I discovered it even before I read The Hobbit. And it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. I remember it was a bit hard because I think I was 12 years old when I started reading. So it was one of the longest books that I had ever read. But it was so different from anything else I'd read. I'd only read children's books and some science fiction from the adult section of the library, because they gave me an adult library card when I was 12 because they had no more children's books. I had read them all, and so I was usually reading science fiction. But then I discovered Lord of the Rings, and I couldn't stop reading. There were parts in there that probably I didn't really get that much, like all the wars and the it's very complicated. There are lots of things going on, and then I read maybe while I was reading the Lord of the Rings, I think I read the Hobbit, and I actually didn't like it that much, because the Lord of the Rings was so epic and so well written, and then the Hobbit felt like a children's book, and not even a good children's book. Now, of course, I liked that it was kind of the same world as the Lord of the Rings, but even the quest that Bilbo is going on with the dwarves, trying to steal the treasure from a dragon, it all felt a little bit subpar compared to this incredible, tense storyline that spans generations and countries, and with all the the machinations of Sauron and the ring. Oh my goodness. Yeah. But over time, of course, my opinion has shifted, and I started to appreciate The Hobbit for what it is. After all, that's how Tolkien started to develop Middle Earth, and he went back and revised it. But even recently, I think was it last year or the year before that, I re-listened to the audiobook of The Hobbit, and I was like, yeah, kind of still feel the same. It's okay. It's an okay story, but it's not The Lord of the Rings. So there you go. Now you can post all your hate in the comment section right now. And then one of those science fiction books that I love to read. It's completely unknown. Even if you Google it, it's not available digitally. There are only a few like secondhand copies that are out there, and they cost a fortune. And I don't know why, because this was one of the most enjoyable science fiction books I've ever read. And the book is called Asgard, or The Asgard Run. And it's written by a guy named Steve Vance. Very kind of generic name, Steve Vance. But The Asgard Run tells the story of a buried spaceship. And it takes place in our world, in the United States somewhere, and when they were digging into a mountain, they found this mysterious door, and the door is closed. Now, I think the door is slightly ajar, but it's way too small to enter, and so but the rest of the surface is extremely smooth. It's this mysterious metal, and they don't know how big that thing is, but it's completely covered in a mountain. And so it has become a tourist attraction, and people can just buy a ticket and go look at that door, and they have a little exposition around it with some theories as to what it could be. And so it's kind of a thing that a lot of people do. And so one day there's this group of tourists, and they arrive there, and there are a few characters that are a bit more inquisitive. None of them know each other at the beginning. And then something changes, and the door opens, and they go, and it's like, what? And they go in, and I think the door closes or something, and then they're trapped in the ship. And the ship is trapped in a mountain. And then the entire book, and this is why I loved it so much. It's like what's the movie, the Poseidon Adventure? I should ask Mike Kuipers, who's in the chat, and he knows everything about these older movies. But isn't there a book about a sunken ship, and then people have to go from one side of the ship to the other in order to escape? Well, this is basically that, but then it's a spaceship, and it's in a mountain, and the spaceship is like the size of I don't know, 5 Titanics. It is enormous, and it's still operational. And so they are trying to, of course, they cannot go back. The door is hermetically sealed, and they have to somehow start to explore the ship. It's abandoned, but all the systems are working. And so, they go from room to room, and then they discover all sorts of weird things. Some people die. It's also very dangerous. And then they discover these elevators that go sideways and at maximum speed, and then the group gets split up, and then they get together again. And it's just this amazing adventure. And it's one of those books that I was a real page turner. It's like, oh, what's going to happen next? And there's a lot of kind of this cool Star Trek like technology that they discover. And over time, of course, because they are all alone, and time is running out, because at one point there's a countdown and they don't know what the countdown is, but they feel like this might actually be a countdown to the end. Maybe the ship will self-destruct or something like that. And so that puts a lot of pressure on them. And then, of course, you get all these different relationships, and some people hate each other, other people fall in love, and it's just such an amazing story. I won't tell you how it ends, just in case it ever gets scanned and becomes a Kindle book. Like, I need to contact the author and thank him for what he wrote, because this is well, you hear me talk about it, and I can't even recommend it because you cannot buy it. It's not available. Ah, come on. It's such an awesome book. Anyway, let's move on to a book that is available and that I think you should absolutely read. And that is the first book of the Silo series by Hugh Howey. The first book is called Wool. And it covers the same story that you can see in the Apple TV show that is based on the book, or on the books, I should say. And so it's the story of an underground society, and they live in silos, basically huge vertical tunnels that have been dug, and then there is a staircase in the middle, and all the people live in circles around that inner tube, and they haven't been out for centuries. And then there's this entire internal structure and organization, and a lot of the world that we take for granted now is forgotten. And a lot of the stuff, even the books, they're considered to be dangerous relics, and you're not allowed to possess them. And so there's a lot of mystery around, why are they underground? What happened to the planet above? And then at one point, the main protagonist is actually going out, and that's the story. I read the book before I saw the series. I loved it. I knew it was going to become an Apple TV series, so I figured, I might as well just first read the book. And what is so amazing is that the book is fantastic. It is absolutely, another page turner. Couldn't stop reading. But what surprised me even more is that the television series also kept me on the edge of my seat, and I loved it. It was just, so incredibly well done. And you can read the book and watch the TV series at the same time. They are compatible, and the books do things very, very well, and the TV show does other things really, really well. So highly recommend that you check it out. I think it's one of the best science fiction stories of the past 5 years. And then, of course, I didn't want to read the next 2 books because I want the TV series to be a surprise. There are going to be, I think, 2 more seasons. So yeah, I feel like I shouldn't read the other 2 books, but I regret it because it's so much fun. And Hugh Howey is also a wonderful guy. He shares a lot on social media and on YouTube. There's some videos in which he shares his reactions to seeing the world that he created at his typewriter or at his desk. To see that built in a set, and to have these amazing actors play the roles that he one day, a long time ago invented. It was an incredible experience. And I love the way he talks about it. It's like, oh man, I can so imagine how that must feel when something that you just wrote with a cup of tea in the morning is now like a major hit, and the entire world is watching it. Let's move on to the next book. Totally different book, but it made such a huge impression when I first read it as a child, and that was The Diary of Anne Frank. Um, I guess most of you are familiar with it. In case you're not, read it. Especially today, because we live in times that are eerily similar in some respects to the world that Anne Frank was living in. And so she describes from her perspective as a teenager, or barely a teenager, um, what the war does, and how people react. And it's so gripping because it's so vivid, and it feels like it's been written yesterday. And I wouldn't be surprised that right now, for instance, in Ukraine, there are young girls the same age of Anne Frank that are writing similar diaries, similar books. Um, because unfortunately, what she describes is something that recurs in history over and over again. Um, it is it is a hopeful book to a certain extent, despite the fact that, of course, Anne Frank did die in a concentration camp. But nevertheless, there's a lot of joy in the book, there's a lot of goodness in the book, and it shows you that in the midst of the darkest times, people can still have wonderful experiences together and can be so incredibly good to one another. And that's what strikes me always when I read the Diary of Anne Frank. It's like this was one of the most horrible wars of the past century, and yet life could still be beautiful. So that's why I love that book. And of course, I eventually went to see the house of Anne Frank in Amsterdam, and that made it all of a sudden more than a book. It made it super real. There's even like a VR app that you can download for free. It's made by the museum that currently curates the House of Anne Frank, because the house itself is no longer looks like the house it was in Anne Frank's time. It's kind of a stylized version of it. It's still the same house, but all the walls have been painted gray, and it's a bit jarring. But the VR app allows you to walk around in the house as it truly was, and it's insane. Yeah, like you're there. You look around, you see the house exactly as it was. Stunning experience. Another book that's pretty old, but that I really enjoyed and would recommend you read, is written by the famous C.S. Lewis, of course, good friend of Tolkien. C.S. Lewis is most well known for his Narnia series, and that is what most people have read. But the book that I read first of C.S. Lewis was The Great Divorce. And I discovered the book in a monastery, of all places. So back then I was in seminary in the French part of Belgium, and oftentimes we would go on these compulsory retreats, and I usually didn't like them because those retreats were in silence and it was kind of boring, and we would have all these, I don't know, my ADHD did not appreciate that kind of environment. And so with some friends, also other seminarians, we sometimes would book our own retreat, and we would go to this tiny little monastery in Belgium with some really nice guys that were living there as monks. I think they were Benedictine monks, but it was a very small community. So and you felt like really you became part of the community while you were on a retreat. So very different from the big monasteries that I was used to going to. And I remember every day the abbot would just speak with us for about an hour, and he would just share his life and the things that he discovered, and we could ask him anything. And at one point, I think we were talking about heaven and eternal life, and of course, at the time I was studying philosophy, so I had a very intellectual approach to all that. And then he mentioned this book. He mentioned The Great Divorce, and he said this is something that really changed his mind on heaven and purgatory and hell, because he said what C.S. Lewis does so well is to show that it's not God who sends people to heaven or to hell, or puts them in a waiting room, the purgatory. No, it's actually the people themselves that decide where they go. And believe it or not, the people that are in hell want to be there. They don't want to go to heaven. And the way in which Lewis makes that clear is the story is so different from, now you think it's like a theology book or a religious book, but it's actually a book about a bus stop. So it starts in this very gray, rainy city where everything looks drab. There's almost no color, and people are waiting for the bus to arrive. And it takes a while, and at one point the bus arrives, and they get onto the bus, and then instead of moving horizontally, the bus moves upwards. And then the first people already start to complain. Why aren't we staying in this city? Where are we going? We want to go back, etc. And then they arrive in a very strange landscape, and then it becomes more like a fantasy story. So the bus stops, and they're surrounded by grassy fields, and there are mountains in the distance, and it is dawn, but the sun is not up yet. I mean, you can see that the sun is behind the mountains, but you can only see the rays. And so everything has this very fresh, early morning, springtime feel to it. But it's still a bit chilly. And then the people are invited to get off the bus. And the protagonist, or the main character that we're following, he steps onto the grass, and the grass goes straight through his feet. It's like, what is happening? And so he has no consistency. Even the grass is stronger than he is. And then I won't tell you the whole story because it's way too amazing to read it for yourself. But then there are these luminous figures that approach him and are inviting him to come along with them. And then you see all the different reactions to that. And there are actually a number of people that do take the bus back to that horrible, dreary city. And then, of course, beyond the mountains, that's probably heaven. And it's such an incredibly well-written story. You can read it in a few hours. It's not very long. But what I loved about it is that it has both this personal angle to it, like you are the one who decides your eternal future. God cannot act beyond your free will, but that's the drama. We have a free will, so we can also choose against God, and God has to allow that. So, hence the idea that hell is an option. It's a possibility. We have to postulate that hell exists because we, as free human beings, have, theoretically at least, the option to completely reject God, and to live an eternal life without God is hell, because we're not made for the absence of love. We're made for love, and so if the love is not there, then we suffer. Anyway, there's a lot of theology, but it is not at all a theory in the book. It's a story that makes you see all of a sudden, like, oh, brilliant! It's so well done. And of course, it's an analogy. It's a metaphor. It's a story. It's a fairy tale. It's not meant to be theology. But it was one of the most original takes I've ever seen or read on eternal life. So go check it out. It's called The Great Divorce. Then, totally different type of books, but boy, oh boy, have I read these with so much excitement. And I actually I've read them 3 times now. It's a trilogy of books written by Blake Crouch. If that name rings a bell, it may be because you have Apple TV Plus. And what was it? Yeah, last year, there was a new science fiction series called Dark Matter, written by Blake Crouch. And that was actually a big hit for Apple. It's also an amazing story. But that wasn't the first story that I read from Blake Crouch. I read the Wayward Pines trilogy. And it is, if you've seen The Truman Show, Imagine the Truman Show, but then dark. And no Jim Carrey, but it's kind of similar. This guy wakes up and he is in a town and he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know where he is. And bit by bit, he discovers that he is actually in a bubble. Like the entire town around him is like in the Truman Show. Everybody plays a role. And he's the only one who doesn't know what's going on. He's not in the loop. Why is he there? Who is behind this? Why are people doing this? And it's dangerous, actually. So he starts to discover that there are cameras hidden in the bushes, and there are microphones, and there is a conspiracy going on. And for the entire first book, you're like, what on earth is going on here? And then it you start to discover what's going on, and it is so much bigger than I thought it would be. And of course, he tries to escape, and then it turns out this entire village is almost impossible to get out of. And he risks his life trying. And oh my goodness, it's so well written. It's so, I mean, I saw that and I was like, this has to become a movie. Why isn't this a movie yet? And so this was actually turned into an HBO drama, if I'm not mistaken. And so there is a television series based on these three books. And I think it even goes beyond the story of the books. But what I loved about it is it's a good TV series. It's really captures kind of especially in the beginning, this claustrophobic idea, like, I'm all alone and everybody is faking it here. The downside is it is a television series, so it's filmed with kind of a relatively modest budget. It's still pretty well done, but especially the more kind of science fiction-y aspects of it, they're not very well executed. But all in all, and then of course the TV series goes at a very fast speed. They kind of rush through the events in the book, so the book is much more. It's almost like a diary of what happens every day, and I like that because you feel like you're there. So this is one of those books that really work well as escapism. You want to be in another world, another reality. Wayward Pines delivers that, and it's and ever since those three books, I've become a huge fan of Blake Crouch. I've read almost everything he wrote, except for the few of the books that he wrote under a pseudonym when he was just a beginning writer. Those books apparently are not that good, but I might read them eventually anyway. But Blake Crouch, remember that name? It's really good science fiction. Next on my list, another great discovery 2 years ago. That was the Scythe trilogy. So Scythe by Neal Shusterman. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And Scythe tells the story of a society where nobody has to die anymore. Technology has advanced, medical care has advanced to such a degree that even if you die, they can resurrect you. That makes, however, things a little crowded on the planet. And so there is this guild of people that every once in a while have to kill someone because people don't die of natural causes anymore. And so hence the name Scythe. It refers to this old image of death, walking around in black robes and carrying a scythe. But they actually have to execute people. And the thing is, they can never do that for personal reasons. So there is a bit of a arbitrary aspect to it, in a sense they just have to kill people, and it can sometimes be for reasons, and sometimes it's just because we just have to kill people. But the thing is, these scythes, these judges over life and death, have to be formed, and they are recruited among kids. And so the protagonists, because there are two kids it's a kind of a young adult series. These two teenagers are recruited by an existing scythe, and then it becomes a bit of an academia type of book. It's a bit like Harry Potter, and you go to school and then you learn how to kill people, basically. But more importantly, they become like pupils of this executioner, and he tries to teach them like kind of the moral underpinnings of what they do and why that is so difficult, and it's a bit of a sacrifice to be a scythe, and nobody wants to become one. And so it's gripping. It's very gripping. It's a very original concept. It does have a bit of that kind of like future noir aspect to it, but because it's told from the perspective of these teenagers, it kind of works, even as a young adult series. I've only read the first book, I have to say. I still want to pick up the other two. But after the first book, I was like, okay, I love this. Great concept. But I have other stuff to read right now. So it wasn't like the Wayward Pines trilogy where it was like I finished the first book and it was like, okay, book number 2, book number 3. Wait, there are no other books. And then, of course, in the same vein, I cannot fail to mention this one because I enjoyed it so much. I read it twice. The entire Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. This was not the first young adult future book, but it definitely was the most popular one, and it became the first of a trend of stories like this, like Divergent, and you had the Maze Runner, and all those books are kind of spiritual successors, you could say, to the Hunger Games. But Suzanne Collins, I think, did it better than anyone else. I also really appreciate why she wrote the books. The books are not just entertainment; they are a warning, and it shows in a imaginary world, of course, certain trends that she sees in society, and things that lead to war, and what that does to people, the cruelty also of people with power and money, and how that can completely destroy your moral compass. And so there is this interview. So I first read the books, and then I listened to the audiobooks. I watched the movies. I have the movies on Blu-ray, and I watched them over and over again. I think they're so good. But at the end of the audiobook, there is a pretty long interview with Suzanne Collins in which she is asked about her motives and how the books came about. It's an amazing interview. Highly recommended. I also really loved the more recent movie based on the prequel books that she's currently writing. So there are 2 books out now, I think, of the story, kind of how the Hunger Games came to be. And that first movie was pretty good as well. I really enjoyed it because it shows the genesis of the bad guy in the Hunger Games, who doesn't start off as a bad guy. And fascinating. I love that kind of stuff. It's like the prequels to Star Wars. You suddenly understand how Darth Vader got started, and it's not what you think. All right, another great science fiction book. It's almost more science than fiction. Is of course The Martian by Andy Weir. An amazing read. Loved it. Read it twice. And again, it's a book that plunges you in a different universe. You are on Mars. And because the book takes it slow and step by step, it works for me. It works much better even than the movie, although I love the movie. But the book is... when I finished the book, I was like, I've been to Mars. I've had a vacation on Mars. It wasn't a very good vacation. It was a bit tense, but oh my goodness, was I there? And so that for me is probably one of the recurring aspects that make me want to come back to certain books. It is if books succeed to plunge me in a different world for the time that I'm reading. Whether it is The Lord of the Rings or The Martian or Wayward Pines, even Silo, the Silo books do that as well. So highly recommend it. Then a fun book, which also should be a movie. And I think they were actually planning on turning that into a movie or a TV series, but I think it's been shelved. Why? It's by John Scalzi. And the book is called Redshirts. And the Trekkies will, of course, immediately think Redshirts, Star Trek. Yeah, definitely, because this is a story about um, extras in a science fiction television series, like Star Trek. It's very similar to Star Trek, but the red shirts, just like in the original Star Trek series, are usually the dispensable characters, the ones that die on an away mission. The thing is, these characters don't know that they are extras in a TV series. And they're not, it's not, the book is not about the actors playing the extras. No, the book is about these fictional extras. And so it is as if there is an alternate reality in which everything people are watching in the TV show is actually real. There is a reality to it. And so they discuss amongst each other, wondering why they never get promoted. Why can't they go on an away mission? And then some of them start to discover that, wait a minute, we're characters in a story. This is, our existence is fictional, and yet we are real. And what? It is so incredibly well done. And I feel like a lot of the interaction and the humor in the book really reminds me of Lower Decks. If you've ever seen the animated series about Star Trek, it's the same idea, and I wouldn't be surprised if Lower Decks actually was inspired by Redshirts. But it's Scalzi does an amazing job in making you immediately picture Star Trek, but he doesn't mention the word Star Trek at all. Obviously, because it's copyrighted. He would be in huge legal trouble if he would have done. But if you read it, it's, yeah, this is about Star Trek. So incredibly well done. So much fun. And then I want to end my list of favorite books with a book that I read 2 years ago. And it was one of the longest books I read. But man, was it good. And it also really inspired me in the novel that I'm currently writing. Not that I pretend to be able to write a book like the one that I will mention in a minute, but it takes place in the Middle Ages, and I really loved the way in which the book transported you into those times and made you feel like you were there. Again, same theme. The book puts you in a world. It's like a time machine, and you are in the Middle Ages for the, 5 days that it took me to read that book. So the book is called Pillars of the Earth. You probably have heard of it. It's written by Ken Follett, who actually wrote a number of these historical fiction books. And it tells the story of how the cathedrals got built. And before you say, oh, boring, whoa, is that a riveting tale? Because it's told from the perspective of a builder, of one of the guys who is contracted by a local bishop to build a cathedral. Or at first, in fact, he just builds a church. But he's really good at it, and he's innovating, and he comes up with these new architectural ways of making the thing bigger. And then there's this bishop, and it says, do me one of those, but then twice as big. And there is drama. There is like this incredible fire at one point. People die. It is a roller coaster. And there are some time jumps in it as well that totally took me by surprise, where all of a sudden you're like a different generation, because of course building a cathedral took sometimes more than a century, and the book brings you along in that process. But it's as if you have been there on the spot and you see how these things were built. A few months ago, I built the Lego set of the Notre Dame. And I was constantly thinking of that book. And I even though I was just building with Lego bricks, I was like, oh, this is, I'm building a cathedral. Such an awesome book. Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. And that concludes my list of my favorite books. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear from you in the comments which books you have read, and if you concur with me, and if you have other books that are part of your favorite. If you had to make like a top 20 of your favorite books, which books would feature in there? I really love the recommendations. So thanks for sharing in advance. And if you like this, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel, because I might not do a big one like this, but I will do my little top 3 and top 5s in different genres maybe every once in a while. If you want me to, let me know. Talk to you later, and thanks for watching.